being the veterinarian, a lot of people yeah, would come up to me and say, "Why are you here?"
Yeah.
And of course, my answer to them was, "Well, this is a retrovirus branch, and that's what I did my PhD in. And why are you here?" The curiosity of being a scientist, where you are asking questions, well, that curiosity carries over. And I found myself just very eager to learn about them. When you show people respect and you listen to them and you understand what role we all play, be curious, and also to advocate for myself.
The guests on the Vet Life Reimagined podcast have a passion for people and the veterinary profession, and Dr. Lairmore is a prime example. He is the immediate past dean of the School of Veterinary Medicine at the University of California, Davis. I actually had no idea how accomplished Michael Lairmore was when I first reached out to him. His soft spoken nature is not to be underestimated. This episode is full of heart, curiosity, and wisdom. Dr. Lairmore even maybe accidentally confessed to a fascinating project at the end, along with a surprisingly ironic part of his life. So make sure you stick to the very end. And please make sure you are subscribed. And if you get value out of the podcast, please make sure to give it a great rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It's one of the best ways to support a podcast. I can tell how much that you loved UC Davis and how much you really put into that university, all the
Mhm.
programs you started. So I'm really excited to go through your career journey, but also because you've been in education or academia for so long, I'm really excited to ask you a lot about your perspective on leadership as well as opportunities for students, because I can tell that's a passion of yours. And then, of course, One Health is really important.
Yeah, I think that's one thing I did think that, we had mentioned related to students that we wanted to talk about careers, and the various opportunities they have, which is, I think, part of your thematic, when I look at your other podcasts, but also it's part of my career and one of the more satisfying parts of my career, creating opportunities for students to explore their passions, essentially. So.
Yes, this is perfect. So,
Mhm.
like I ask everyone, because I think this is a really interesting part of all of our stories, is
Mhm.
what is the story of how you knew you wanted to go into veterinary medicine?
Typical of some students that come into veterinary medicine in which it was an early calling. So about the age of 15, I announced to my parents that I wanted to be a veterinarian. And it was probably from roaming the hills of Missouri and, collecting bugs and thinking about, what interested me. But also we had animals in our house and dogs and pets and things. And so I announced that, but it was an interesting reaction because none of my parents had ever gone to college, let alone, a professional school. So I knew that I needed help to get into the profession. So I started to talk to my teachers at school and other people, and I applied at a local veterinarian to work there. I was too young to work at the time, and but I persisted. I went up to my high school counselor and said my desire to go to the University of Missouri, and because I grew up in Independence, Missouri, and to be a veterinarian. And he quickly said, "Get another plan." Very few people from my high school went to college. The chances of me getting into the university, it was very discouraging. I didn't take that discouragement for long. A principal from the school, Richard Franklin, and that tells you a lot that I remember his name, called a local veterinarian and said, "Can you give this kid a job? He's asking about, veterinary medicine. We have no pre-college program, let alone that." And the veterinarian said, "Yeah, who is he?" And he said, "Oh, yeah, he's applied here 3 times." So he did give me a job. His name was Max Scanlon, and Charles Scanlon played a very important role as a mentor, and that's something that I imprinted on, is what a valuable role a mentor plays in a young person's life, and that carried with me the rest of my life. And there I got mentoring from him of how to study in high school and how to get into college, first of all, at the University of Missouri. And it turns out that I had an imposter syndrome in a different way, which was, first kid to college, was very concerned that I would not make it into veterinary school and studied constantly to get in and got in after 3 years and felt very elated, like everybody, to get into veterinary school. And because of my background in practice as a kennel boy, I wanted to be a small animal veterinarian initially. But one of the things that happened to me, which is true with a lot of veterinarians, is my path changed. About halfway through, I was exposed to two areas that I was completely unaware of. One is large animal medicine. I really had some great large animal clinicians. They showed me the value of things like population health and epidemiology and helping communities. So I switched to become a large animal tract veterinarian and eventually went into dairy practice in Pennsylvania when I got out. The other thing that I was exposed to, which was an idea that the very same veterinarian I worked for as a kennel boy, because he had left practice and gone on to graduate school, is to do a small research project. And as a veterinary student, they offered small grants called Phi Zeta grants, all of like $500. But I worked with a PhD student, Dr. Scanlon, and he helped me understand what it was like to get involved in research. And we had to do a presentation in front of an audience, which was terrifying, and learn how to deal with hypothesis, data, and experimental design, et cetera. But from that, I was very fortunate. The paper did get published from the work that we had done, and that was my first experience to scientific writing. But I went into practice, and I wanted to be the next James Herriot. That was I love those books. I read all of them. Great Creature, All Creatures Great and Small. And from that experience, I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed southeastern Pennsylvania. About 25% of my clients were Amish.
Mm.
I learned a lot. I learned a lot in about people, about communities, about how veterinarians are involved in public health in the community. Such important lessons. But then another event happened, and this is another theme to a lot of veterinarians' lives, is that as you make plans, life happens. I became a young father, and my son, who was my firstborn, really changed my thinking, because now I realized, wow, I had an awesome responsibility to be a father and to be there for him and to raise a young family. And so I started to think about other aspects of the veterinary profession that I could be involved in that would allow me to also manage my family life. And that's a common theme today for veterinary students, is how do you manage life at the same time you're trying to manage your career? So I applied to internal medicine and pathology jobs because I was still very interested and passionate about the whole animal, so to speak. And I was very fortunate to get a pathology residency PhD position at Colorado State University, which I had never visited, had never been there. I knew it was in the mountains. I did not know a lot about the program. And back then, we didn't even have the internet. So this was 1983. And so to apply to graduate school is totally by the JAVMA journal and what colleagues may tell you about the program. And I went there and I was very, very fortunate. It was a growing department. It had a lot of exciting new hires. Dr. Ed Hoover, who was eventually a member of the National Academy of Sciences, was the department chair. And I got involved in virus research and I stayed with ruminants. I started initially studying malignant catarrhal fever, which only veterinarians know what that means. Said that to another colleague and other professions, they don't know what you're talking about. An event happened again in the laboratory one day. And that is my advisor walked in to the lab and he put on the table an electron micrograph, an 8 by 10 of a virus particle. The graduate students in the lab, we knew what it was. We said, oh, that's a lentivirus. That's a a unique shape of a retrovirus that was common in sheep, as we all know, ovine progressive pneumonia, as we're trained in virology and veterinary medicine. And my advisor said, no, that came from a patient, one of the first patients, that was dying of AIDS in San Francisco. And right away, we knew things were going to be different because before then, retroviruses weren't even really that well known in humans. They'd only been associated with human disease in 1980. And of course, all veterinarians know that retroviruses are common pathogens, which we've known about in a variety of forms, from equine, infectious anemia to bovine leukemia virus and to feline, leukemia virus for many, many decades. So, but what happened was the major epidemic that was occurring in the human population, AIDS, was just developing and devastating populations around the world. So, very similar to what's happened with COVID, things changed, and a lot of the focus, not only of the world of microbiology, but the world focused on AIDS. Because I was trained in a virology lab, I switched my project, and the rest is sort of history. I studied retroviruses the rest of my entire career. And because of that, parallels between viruses of sheep and humans, I was able to publish in both the veterinary journals, but also human journals, because we were showing the relevance, the commonality of the pathogenesis, the same cell types that were being infected. And that opened up another whole world, which after my PhD and residency training, I was recruited to the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta by a veterinarian, very famous one, Fred Murphy. And Fred was one of the people that worked out the pathogenesis of rabies virus. And so Fred was developing a new branch at the Centers for Disease Control called the Retrovirus Diseases Branch. And it was an exciting time. We were there. I was the only veterinarian in the branch. I was working with colleagues from epidemiology to other virologists, and began to be very excited about how I could, as a viral pathogenesis person, contribute to a broader field, and got involved with human retroviruses. And they needed people to study things like HTLV1, which is a human virus that causes leukemia in people, and was just described in 1980. So it wasn't that long before I started. And able to set up a reference laboratory to screen for that in the blood supply, and used standards and helped establish the standards for screening the blood supply for that. And the reason I tell veterinary students this story when I ask them what they're interested in is because I want them to know that there are many, many paths to follow in the veterinary profession, much of those like you featured on this podcast before. And one of those is may not be apparent to you as you're going through your training. Here, I wanted to be a small animal veterinarian. I did become a large animal veterinarian, but I'd never dreamed that I would be studying viruses, let alone viruses that were involved in a major human epidemic that was devastating the public health system at the time. And I really enjoyed my time at the CDC. I got to do a number of studies, including isolation of viruses from populations around the world, including the Guayni Indians in the Central America area, and discovered a new virus, HTLV2, as it was called, in endemic indigenous Indians. And that sort of changed a paradigm thinking of how these viruses were in the American Indian population. It turns out they probably were with them for a long time. In fact, carried maybe over the Bering Land Strait as they migrated, because after that discovery, it was discovered in the Seminole Indians and others. So those are the kind of things that were extremely exciting as a veterinary pathologist and virologist to be studying, those kind of things. And I was recruited to the Ohio State University. I was there a while because I say the Ohio
The
State.
Ohio. You said it right.
They made you say that. So, but they had they had the foresight to form a group that took advantage of the research around retroviruses, and feline leukemia virus was And they had developed Richard Olson had developed the first vaccine for feline leukemia virus there. And they used that money to recruit other scientists, including me. It was again, a very exciting time at a university that, with a lot of colleagues that were focused on that eventually developed into a number of different things. One is my research took off in a very positive direction, so much so that we eventually developed a program project grant out of the National Cancer Institute that I led with the support of the Cancer Center. I was eventually recruited to be an associate director at the Cancer Center because of that, including, my assigned roles within the veterinary college. I was very fortunate to be recruited into leadership positions at the same time as I was developing my lab. And one of the things that changes over time in anybody's career as these opportunities come up is your own thinking. So as I was trying to be, a scientist and trying to get grants and try to mentor graduate students, which I really enjoyed, I realized that as the program developed, I developed other skills, other things grew within my repertoire as well. And that's typical of these changes as we go through our careers. You develop skills that you didn't think you have. And other people see things in you that you may not recognize. So I had people come up to me and said, you need to be the graduate studies chair. You need to be the department chair. And each one of these times I said, no, I'm doing too much. I don't, I've got my lab, I've got my students. But when I was able to take advantage of those opportunities and apply for those positions, again, things started to happen and more things around me developed that I really felt very fortunate about. And so in early 2000s, I was recruited to be a department chair. My program project grant was funded, and I was associate director at the Cancer Center. So, I'm flashing back to all these things, as a boy in Missouri growing up who didn't even know, whether he was going to go to college. And now I have all these opportunities. And it was because of the veterinary profession, because I was in a world of One Health. I was being trained in an area that applied to both humans and other species. And so I had that background of the other species that allowed me to be valuable in teams of people at the Cancer Center, to later eventually being inducted into the National Academy of Medicine. And I sometimes pinch myself to think that I had those opportunities because I was curious, because I had the right environments. Certainly serendipity does play a role, because being at the right place at the right time, but also working very hard and having supportive colleagues, supportive family at the time to be able to take advantage of those opportunities. And I was very happy at Ohio State University and had reached those accolades. And then I got a phone call. UC Davis, a friend of mine, called me and said, you need to think about this job. And I said, what job? And he goes, the dean at UC Davis. And I'm going, wow, I knew it was a great school. It was ranked number one. It had a very strong background in research. It had a great, clinical program, but I was completely, a little bit had to be talked into it, so to speak, to apply. And it was quite a change to go from Ohio to California. I had a lot of conversations with my family to say, is this the right move? And fortunately, my children had grown up by that time, had gone into college. And so we were empty nesters, my wife and I. And so we took the plunge, interviewed, and was very fortunate to be offered the job in 2011 at UC Davis, and spent the last 10 years as dean of that great school, and learned and grew even more in that leadership position. Got opportunities to be president of the National Association of Veterinary Colleges, to be able to travel around the world as a leader in veterinary education. And again, was very, very fortunate to be at the right place. And it was a great fit. And I learned so much about growing programs, supporting students, all of the issues that you've talked about on your podcast. from debt relief to the imposter syndrome to the mental health issues. We were dealing with those at a school level, and as an administrator, trying to find support for programs and fund those programs to help the students, the faculty, and the staff in doing their jobs. So, in a nutshell, that was a long way from the fields of Missouri.
Yes, but what a journey.